The discourse around Frieren Beyond Journey's End has always been a bit vexing to me. For some reason, every time I see this series being recommended online, I always see it being recommended with this caveat of, oh, if you're just looking for action, this might not be the series for you. And like, even though I could see how this sentiment would arise, Frieren definitely does have a very multifaceted appeal that extends beyond just squabbles. Look, bro, all I'ma say is this: don't let the pretty flower fields and the cutesy character interactions get you fooled. This series is most definitely still an elite battle series if I've ever seen one, and if you want to disagree with me, that's fair. I can live with that. But first, watch this fucking AMV, bro. What makes Frieren's battles so interesting to me is the fact that they really don't need to be this good. Like I said before, this series has a very multifaceted, well-rounded appeal, and for what it's worth, Frieren could cut every fight scene out of the series and still end up having a pretty decent story that would still probably garner a pretty decently sized fan base even without the fights. I'm getting a bit off topic here, but I do think Frieren is in a very unique situation in that regard. Most stories, even stories that fall into multiple genres, have like a core element that carries the narrative, whether that be the romance, the action, the drama, whatever. Now, a lot of series double dip, you know, a lot of series dabble in two or more elements, and some series manage to juggle multiple elements very well, but I don't think I've ever seen a series juggle its elements as seamlessly as Frieren does, where you can remove entire elements and still have a fully fleshed out entertaining story. You could cut the action entirely out of Frieren and still have a pretty entertaining romance / drama story. You can cut the life moments out of Frieren and still have a pretty good action romance seinen type story. You could cut the romance out entirely and still have a pretty good life battle shonen. You see what I'm putting down here, bro? All of what I just said is low-key besides the point. I kind of just wanted to put that thought out there because I feel like it sums up the beauty of Frieren's writing pretty well. Like, I feel like I was really cooking these past 2 minutes, but what I want to do for the remainder of this video is really zero in on one of these elements in particular. I really want to dial in on the way that Frieren handles its action, because I feel like as great as the fights in this series are, for some reason the fights are the least discussed aspect of the show, which is pretty odd when you think about it. Normally action tends to float to the top of anime discourse, but I guess that just goes to show how well-rounded Frieren is and blah 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 blah. Let me not repeat myself for the 100th time, because I will sit here and just yap about how well-rounded this show is over and over again if y'all let me. The latter third of Frieren Beyond Journey's End takes us through an examination arc, the first class mage exam. Structurally, I'd say this arc was somewhat of a departure from what we'd witnessed in Frieren so far. It was the first arc that kind of explicitly mirrored that standard shonen setup, and so for a show that was pretty episodic and unpredictable up until this point, it was low-key kind of weird to see them trying their hand at a more traditional trope-driven kind of arc. Exam arcs are interesting because even though they're usually made up of multiple battles, in the grand scheme of the story, they're kind of meant to be viewed as one singular battle, and because these exams are often split into distinct sections or mini exams within the larger exam, it's really easy to pinpoint each section's role in the narrative, because by design, each round kind of already exists in this compartmentalized manner. Personally, I feel like the Frieren exam arc is extra convenient in this regard, because each of the individual tests within this exam align perfectly with the 3 tenets that I think make for a good fight in the first place. And so by looking at each round in the first class mage exam, I think I can paint a pretty good picture about why the battles in Frieren work so well. The first and probably the most fundamental aspect to building a good battle is introducing compelling stakes. Now, Frieren, ironically enough, usually isn't a show that has super crazy stakes. That's like kind of the whole gimmick in the beginning of the show. It's just a chill ass show cosplaying as this epic fantasy adventure. As the story progresses, every now and then the narrative will dip in the life or death territory just to keep niggas on their toes, but let's just keep it a buck right now. The stakes in Frieren usually aren't that massive. unless Frieren big greedy ass is eating them shits. To offset the lack of narrative stakes in the show, Frieren gets us invested in its characters to the point where the character arcs end up being the main thing that keeps you locked in. And so while a lot of shows embed their stakes within the narrative itself, Frieren takes the approach of developing its stakes alongside its characters. This takes us back to the first test in the exam and how it relates to this whole concept of getting us invested and building up the stakes. We've already established that Frieren builds its stakes alongside its characters, and so by introducing a whole new roster of compelling characters all at once, Frieren is essentially super boosting its stakes game, bruh. It's pumping a whole load of fresh new stakes into the narrative. Whoa, super pause on that, bro. Whoa, I didn't even realize how crazy that shit sounded until I had to say it out loud, bro. Pumping a whole load of fresh new stakes in it. Come on now, bro, lock in. The first exam goes above and beyond when it comes to introducing these new characters for us to get invested in. Instead of just dumping all of these characters into the plot haphazardly and letting us as the audience sort out the appeal of these characters on our own, the first test in the exam actually divides these characters into very calculated and intentional pairings that stand to highlight each individual character's appeal by means of contrast. Frieren's magical expertise, for example, really stands out since she was paired up with two novices, and inversely, the scrappiness and ambition of these two novices really stood out in comparison to Frieren, who did not give a damn about that test. Dinkin, who is essentially just a swell, cool-ass guy, ended up looking extra cool when paired up against Richter, who is honestly just a hater for no reason at all. Land and 𝙏𝙏 were damn near perfect foils of one another, Land representing strength in the most orderly and calculated manner possible, while 𝙏𝙏 embodied a comparable level of strength off of nothing but pure chaos and tweakery. For just about every character that actually matters to the story, you'll see that within the first exam, these characters are introduced with either a compelling narrative arc or just an all-around charismatic presence. And so now that we've established how Frieren uses the first test to get us invested in these characters and by proxy establish some stakes, I want to take a look at the second exam and talk about how it embodies what I think is arguably the most important pillar for writing a good anime fight: the spectacle. One advantage that animation will always have over other forms of visual media is its ability to produce a spectacle. Animation, in my opinion, is the closest thing that humanity has to the imagination. It is the single most powerful tool that can be employed when attempting to bring fiction into reality. And so when I say that I hold anime fights to a pretty high standard when it comes to spectacle, I feel like that's a fair standard to hold. Visual spectacle low-key carries anime as a genre, let's be real. There are some anime that can get by without it, but there's a lot of overlap between the most popular anime in the world and the prettiest anime in the world, and I don't think this correlation is the result of mere coincidence. Simply put, Frieren is beautiful, although I'm more of a flaum guy myself. Oh yeah, and the animation is pretty cool too. Frieren is definitely one of those shows that goes with the quality over quantity approach when it comes to fights. You may not get a full-length fight in every single episode of the season, but you can bet your nuts that when you do get a squabble, that shit is most definitely gonna pop off. Honestly, with the way Frieren is animated, I could use just about any fight in the series to illustrate my point on spectacle, but for the sake of staying in line with the whole first-class mage exam theme, I want to use the dungeon faring second test to illustrate this point. Frieren versus Frieren. Need I say more? Frieren fighting her replica at the climax of the dungeon arc was probably the single most grand spectacle of the entire season. It felt like the animators were thanking me for watching their show, bruh. It felt like I should have been paying pay-per-view for that shit, bruh. The choreography, the animation, the effects, the sound design, all of it was moving on demon mode for Nah, Frieren said we don't fuck with demons. All of it was moving on elf mode for the entire duration of the fight, and so I think it's entirely fair to say that if nothing else, the second phase of the mage exam embodies the essential pillar of spectacle that's needed when it comes to constructing a good fight. So now we have the first two pillars and the first two tests covered. That leaves us with one more test and one more pillar respectively. The third and final test of the first class mage exam was definitely the oddball of the 3 tests. Test 1 and 2 were like these extravaganzas, bro. All sorts of magical powers and interesting character interactions were just stacking on top of each other left and right. And so when they stripped all of those dynamics out of the narrative and decided to have test 3 be essentially a live Tinder session for Siri, I'm not gonna lie, I was a bit underwhelmed at the idea. The third and final pillar of writing a good fight is having a good payoff. After you get me invested with the stakes and entertain me with the spectacle, I want to leave the fight feeling like it was worth it. I want to leave the fight with some sort of satisfaction from what I just experienced. I've always found that a lot of anime, in general, tend to have a hard time when it comes to sticking the landing. I don't want to dwell on that point too much. That honestly sounds like a topic for its own video, but I do always keep that in mind when I approach the end of an anime, because writing endings is hard, bro. I think it's important to remember that the first class mage exam arc was a Fern-centric arc. Low-key the only Fern-centric arc in the series so far. Frieren kinda just took the exam for shits and giggles. We know she didn't really give a damn about becoming a first-class mage, and she easily would have qualified if it had not been for the bias of Siri. But for Fern, the first-class mage exam was a legitimate test of her capabilities as a mage. Look, bro, I'll just speak for myself, but Fern getting acknowledged by Siri to the extent that she did was probably the most hype moment in the series for me. That was a straight up lie. It was definitely when Stark was fighting that little demon chick, but for the sake of this video, we're just gonna pretend it was the Fern moment. You see, Fern wasn't just acknowledged. A lot of mages were acknowledged that day, and all of those mages were amazing mages in their own right. But Fern wasn't just acknowledged. Fern had Siri fiending, bruh. Fern had this little elf lady acting out of character. The thing about Fern is that she spent most of the first season with the unfortunate fate of being in the shadow of damn near a literal demigod. Sure, we knew she was a strong mage, a prodigious mage even, but it was just impossible for that level of strength to really shine when we had goddamn Jesus Christ over here taking fat dookies on every obstacle that stepped in her party's way. This is why seeing Frieren fail the test and Fern pass the test was the perfect payoff for not just this arc, but honestly the entire first season as a whole. Throughout all of the first season, the narrative flirted with this idea that Fern could be on Frieren's level, but every time she got within that ethos, every time she got remotely close, Frieren would up the ante once more and pull some new shit out of her bag that would just dwarf the progress that Fern had made. It got kind of annoying, bro, I'm not gonna lie, and it started to remind me of another white-haired OP sensei that I am not very fond of. And then this final exam came along. Through Siri's dialogue in the final exam, we get actual solidified confirmation that 1, the girl Fern is really like that, and 2, Frieren really isn't all that we thought she was, at least relative to an elf of her age. And just hearing that, not only does it set up endless possibilities for stronger enemies in the coming seasons, but it also gives Fern's development into an elite mage, a narrative arc which we witnessed from her literal childhood, might I remind you. It gives that narrative arc a satisfying and consistent payoff. And that's not something that many anime can pull off so gracefully.